This is Groundswell Radio with Peter Williams, standing up against unworkable regulations and providing a strong advocacy voice for everyday Kiwis.
Hello and welcome to Groundswell Radio, a weekly look at issues affecting the rural communities in this country, brought to you by Groundswell NZ. I'm your host, Peter Williams, and in this first edition, I'm talking with Groundswell founders, Bryce McKenzie and Laurie Patterson, about how Groundswell came into existence and why now it's more important than ever. Later in the show, Groundswell's environmental spokesman, Jamie McFadden. But first up, the man who started it all, Bryce McKenzie. One of the co-founders of Groundswell is Southland farmer Bryce McKenzie. In fact, it might be said that Groundswell was his idea originally before some others came on board. Bryce, thanks for joining us here on Groundswell Radio. Tell us about the very early stages. I understand it all came about after you posted something on Facebook.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. And I'm actually from Otago. I'm across the border. I'm not.
My apologies.
That's okay. I was born in Southland, but no, I reside in Otago. But yeah, look, it all happened because it was back in August 2020, and I had seen the National Policy Statement on fresh water come out, and I was really agitated about it. And I do what all husbands do. I complained to my wife until she got fed up with me complaining and said, do something about it then. And I mean, you feel a little bit helpless. I was never a big social media person anyway, but she said to me, do a post on Facebook or something. So I did. I sat down and I wrote a piece about why I was so peed off with the whole thing and how I thought it was just not able to work. And I'd hardly hit the go button, and I had a person ring me who is actually, at that stage, was quite an influencer, which I didn't even know what they were, and social media. I just happened to be a friend of hers as well, and I didn't even know she was an influencer. But she had read it, and she rang me and said, Bryce, I want to be able to share this. And I said, oh, well, yeah, that's fine, just share it. She said, no, but I can't. You need to change the settings. Well, I mean, that was a bit alien to me, Peter. I'm not young anymore, and something like that was a bit challenging for me. But however, I managed to make it so it could be shared, and she shared it. And from there, it went viral. It got shared over 6,000 times, and it was predicted that reached about 1.2 million people.
Wow. So tell me in particular, Bryce, before we go on to the way it spread, what were the real issues that got up your nose in the first place to take you to the keyboard to have a blast the way you did?
Okay, well, to give a wee bit of background, Peter, I was a founding member of our local water care group, the Pomahaka Water Care Group, and it was deemed to be one of the most unsavoury water bodies, especially in the lower part of the South Island, but probably in New Zealand. And it didn't have a very good track record for healthy water. And I was a founding member of that group. In fact, there was only two of us went to the initial meeting, so we decided we better do something about it. And we called another meeting where about 6 or 7 turned up. And from then we formed the Pomahaka Water Care Group, which is an award-winning group and has managed to turn this water body around so that it's constantly on there proven as a much better body of water than it was when we first started. So I knew what it took to actually achieve good water quality, and it wasn't through regulation. It was through the buy-in from people who had hands-on and could actually do something about it. So what we did was try and get a lot of people to do a little bit rather than one or two try and do everything. So we just tried to change general farm practices and make people aware of what they were doing and what consequence it had on the environment around them. And that worked. And then when the National Policy Statement on fresh water came out, of course, it was setting sowing dates and all, there were so many things in it that actually just weren't possible to be able to be achieved. And the classic one was the sowing dates. Everything had to be back in grass by the 1st of November, and then it was going to go after 3 years. That would be the 1st of October. All work ground would have to be back in grass. And I mean, anybody that lives at this end in New Zealand knows that just is almost absolutely impossible 9 out of 10 years. So that gave a bit of background on why I was so annoyed about it and why I wrote the post.
Indeed. What did you do with the Pomahaka River? Because we often hear that it's been a wonderful turnaround story. Is it about keeping the animals away from it, doing planting along the banks? What was the main key to the success there?
Just people being aware, Peter. Look, we've done a lot of things, and fencing waterways off is one of them, riparian plantings. We've done all of that. But I guess the biggest thing is to get people to acknowledge that they need to be conscious of how they do things in everyday life and what effect it has on, and in this case, the body of water or on the environment. And that's the big breakthrough. Once you get people doing a little bit of caring about how they're moving the stock, what they're doing when they're crossing waterways, keeping stock out of waterways, just, general things, because we all imagine it's a main body of water, but it's not. Every tributary has to be looked after in the same way. So there's hundreds of things we did, Peter, but every little bit went into helping.
So your post on Facebook, which sort of started things off, was, I understand, around about the middle of 2020. I think most New Zealanders became really aware of Groundswell's existence about a year or so later, in the middle of the winter of 2021, with the big tractor protest. I was in Auckland that day, and I was staggered working with a former colleague of mine, Ryan Bridge. We were at Sky City, and next minute, all these huge tractors were rolling up and down Hobson and Victoria Streets. It was quite a sight to behold, but that was the culmination, really, of a lot of anger, I imagine, on the part of farmers. And it also meant a heck of a lot of organisation to get all those tractors into towns and cities up and down the country.
Yes, Peter, it actually took a lot of organising, but I'd have to say that once we had announced what we were doing, we were overrun by volunteers. And that really gave us a feeling of how downtrodden farmers felt, and they felt they had lost their voice. So, yes, it took a lot of organising, but there were so many willing people that wanted to help. In fact, we had more people wanting to help than we could actually accommodate. And because of that, some of the people we chose to coordinate towns and cities, some of them didn't stump up terribly well. We ended up getting rid of a number of people because they used it as their own personal campaign. But it was monitored very well because the public in New Zealand bought into it, and more so than we ever thought, because we thought it was going to be predominantly, it wasn't just predominantly farmers. There was a lot of people who claimed to be supporting farmers that jumped on board. And our biggest worry, Peter, to be quite honest, is we thought there might have been so much anger out there that people would take the law into their own hands. And we were really concerned with that leading up to the protest, and we did a lot of social media encouraging people that if they felt they were going to get out of control, please to stay away. So, and it seemed to pretty much work by and large right throughout New Zealand. We were pretty pleased with the whole thing, really.
So you had that very visible success, but that's coming up a couple of years ago. Do you believe you've actually changed attitudes in the halls of power? You've been to Parliament, you've presented petitions. Do you believe you've actually changed any thinking? Have you changed any legislation, for a start?
Well, that's a really interesting one and a difficult one to answer. I mean, we're constantly being asked by people in political circles what we think now. So I guess they're conscious of that. We got sent a thing yesterday or the day before saying that, Groundswell has had such an effect on national and the act that they're now incorporating what Groundswell's been saying into their policies. I can't say that we've really noticed that to any extent, but obviously some other people think that is happening. And yes, I think that because we've tried to aim it at the government and their lack of consultation with people when they're actually trying to what would you say, legislate to try and what they perceive as going to help New Zealand, but not consulting with the people involved, is causing a great deal of angst. And so I guess they're conscious that we're there, that we're watching all the time, and that we're not afraid to speak out, Peter.
But there are still serious issues that farmers face, and it's not helped, I imagine, by some of the levy groups, the Dairy NZs and the Beef and Lambs, and at times even in Federated Farmers. But tell me, have you actually had any success? You know, you mentioned earlier on in this chat about the sowing date, the 1st of November, all your winter pasture had to be back in grass. All your winter crops, rather, had to be back in grass. Have you actually been able to get that changed to something more logical,
Yes.
something more sensible?
Yes, we have, Peter. Yes, now it's just, it got changed as to being as soon as practical, which, I mean, everybody aims at anyway, because nobody wants the paddock sitting bare with nothing growing in it anyway. So we all try and do that. So yes, there has been changes. Can we put them down to just groundswell? No, it's combined with a number of organisations. Federated Farmers did some great work. I see Beef and Lamb are claiming it was them that managed to get the changes. So it was a combined effort, Peter. But yes, we stirred more than anybody else initially. So I guess we motivated people to say, well, this is wrong, it needs change. So yes, there has been changes without a doubt.
Very good. Bryce, at this stage, we'll wrap things up on this edition of Groundswell Radio, but I'm sure that we're going to talk many times in the weeks ahead. So thank you for your time for this time round. And after the break, we'll go to your co-founder of Groundswell, Laurie Patterson. Thanks, Bryce.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, listeners.
Groundswell Radio with Peter Williams, bringing town and country together. This is Groundswell Radio with Peter Williams, standing up against unworkable regulations and providing a strong advocacy voice for everyday Kiwis.
You're with Groundswell Radio, talking now to the other co-founder of Groundswell, Laurie Patterson. And Laurie, first up, thanks for joining us on Groundswell Radio. Tell us about your situation. Whereabouts do you operate as a farmer?
Well, Peter, we're actually right on the border of East and South and then West Otago. In fact, the border runs right up our boundary fence. Place called Waikaka, a really good farming area and just a great part of rural New Zealand, really. A very good community, of people who are all working together, if you like, in the agricultural sector because everyone depends on everybody else.
Well, I know that you've had frustrations working in the agricultural sector because of the regulations being imposed upon you. So what was it that got you heavily involved with Groundswell back in the early days, 2 or 3 years ago?
Well, I think really it was driven from the national policy statement on fresh water that was released. And there were some things in that really that, were pretty crazy, as in the one that really springs to mind, of course, is trying to have one sowing date for all of New Zealand, and how anyone that went through the New Zealand education system couldn't realise that New Zealand is effectively a long, narrow country, 1,600 kilometres long, and Northland's in the subtropics, and Southland, I think where we are, is about 46 degrees. So totally different. And how you think you could have one centralised sowing date, I don't know. So on the strength of that, I actually, or my wife actually, read a post that Bryce McKenzie put on Facebook, which effectively said all the same things about how he was totally frustrated after a lifetime of farming, really, and extremely worried about what was going to happen to future generations. And my wife said, well, I'm sick of you actually telling me all this stuff. Why don't you give Bryce a ring? So I did. And even though I knew who Bryce McKenzie was, we had never ever sat down for a beer or had a yarn effectively or anything like that. But I just rang him up and said, look, if you're going to drive your tractor to Gore, mine's fueled up and I'm coming with you. And we actually put a few things on Facebook, and when on the day came to set off, we weren't too sure if there'd be just two of us driving our tractors to Gore, but we were determined we were going to do it anyway. It didn't matter if there was only two, but I was waiting in Waikaka on my tractor, and the next thing, one of the local contractors turned up. We had about 3 or 4 tractors there, and then the local trucking company turned up with 2 bulk fertiliser spreaders. And I said to them, hey, look, we're going to be pretty slow going to town. You guys might have something else to do. And they said, no, we'd absolutely depend on you guys. And so we're coming with you. And that's the strength, I think, of the rural community, that everybody knows that, like, we depend on those guys and they depend on us. And so everyone could see, I think, that just putting unworkable regulations out there and strangling the farming sector was just, well, ridiculous.
Well, I know that you've had a victory, I guess, in terms of, getting the sowing dates changed, so that no longer applies, and there, a bit of common sense has come through from Wellington. But what are the big battles now that farmers are facing and the agricultural sector is facing because of the government regulation? In your opinion, what's the most important issue facing the farming sector?
Well, I think really it's the fact that we've got set up a 2-tier, if you like, economy for rural land, if you like. And one of that is sheep and beef and dairy farmers who operate in the market overseas, and that market goes up and down, and New Zealand farmers are not subsidised in anything, so farmers have to wear the cost and worry of all that. And then we've got another system, which really is the ETS carbon credit forestry system, where people that can buy farmland and plant trees on it effectively have a guaranteed income, more than we can make off sheep, beef or dairy. And that's just going to lead to the whole, if you like, decimation of the rural communities of New Zealand. And the New Zealand economy is really actually, while there's a lot of talk about the Auckland economy and all the rest of it, it's actually driven out of the regions. And to actually, if you like, strangle that, it's just insane, really, Peter.
So around your neighbourhood in Eastern Southland, West Otago, how much good productive land has been sold up to the tree farmers, to the forestry farmers? How many sheep and beef have been taken off the land in order for Pinus radiata to be planted?
Well, just right where we are, not a lot, but there are farms going all the time. And in the Clutha area, which is not far away from where we are, there's 23 farms there that have either gone into trees wholly or partially. And that actually has created a loss of 111,500 stock units. And I was talking to one of the vets down there the other day, and in their practice, that's a loss of $432,000. And if you spread that across, it would be a loss of $8.8 million to Clutha's economy. So, this is big, and there's more farms all the time going into trees. I know there was a property not far from here a while ago that went on the market. 4 outfits looked at it, and none of them were farmers. They were all tree companies. So that's just telling you what's happened. Farmers actually, it's not even worth putting your hand up anymore.
So, Laurie, can you give us some numbers? If, say, you've got, I'll just pick a size of a farm out of the air. Say, if a farm around your area is 300 hectares and it's on the market, what would be the gross revenue for that property if you're farming sheep or beef compared to what you're going to get if you plant the whole lot in trees? Do you have those numbers available by way of comparison?
I don't have them just off the top of my head, but at the moment in the market, I think the tree companies can afford to pay just about half as much again as what a sheep farmer could or beef farmer could to buy the same property.
This is per hectare.
So it's big, and if the price of carbon goes up, then the difference just gets wider and wider and wider. And we've already had people in the government and that wanting to drive the price of carbon up to $200. I think at the moment it's about 70 or 80 or something. So it'll just get wider and wider. And part of the great grand strategy, I saw figures the other day that said that by 2050, an area half the size of the North Island would have to be in pine trees to actually, meet all our emissions things. Well, that's just insane. We can't afford to, plant half of the North Island area productive land and pine trees, and take all the income from sheep and beef. And one of the things on the edge of that is that we've just gone through COVID, and the Prime Minister and also the Minister of Finance are, often saying what good shape New Zealand's economy's in, compared to all the rest. Rah, rah, rah. Well, during that period, the rural sector, and if you think about the meat industry and also the dairy industry, they pumped about $30 billion a year into the economy. Everything else ground to a halt, and because of COVID. And so, that money kept coming in all the time, and there were some massive changes that had to be made, particularly in the meat industry, where the meat companies had to suddenly have distancing in all their plants, and everything had to arrive on time, and it was huge. And so we're an essential industry, and now having gone through that, we seem to be back to being the pariah, the cause of all climate change, rah, 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 etc.
Well, it's just
so farmers are feeling
just deeply distressing.
Pretty disappointed.
Yeah, it's just deeply distressing that so much productive land is being sold up to have trees planted on it. So you talk about the forestry companies paying sort of 50% more per hectare. Around your part of the country, Laurie, and certainly in South Otago, where all that farmland has gone, what is the price per hectare of sheep and beef farming land? Are you sort of around $30,000 a hectare, or is it a bit more than that?
Well, actually, I haven't sat down and actually worked it out just recently, Peter, but it's just the difference. That's the key thing.
Yeah.
You can't actually we're operating with two different separate, if you like, income streams. One that's actually based on a real market, and one that's based on a made-up market. And the problem is, it's a bit like, it doesn't matter what New Zealand does, that's a problem, because we're only 0.17% of the world's emissions anyway, and China's 40%. So if you were running a business and you had a problem, you'd go to where the 40% is, you wouldn't go to the 0.17%. So really, it's sort of like being set up to fail, and that's highly distressing for people, particularly when they put their, life's work in. We've got family properties that have been in farming families for generations, and the young generations taking over are just saying, what the hell? What am I doing this for?
Indeed.
Because they can't see a way out of it. They just think that, they'll keep farming, and then in the end they'll have to plant all their good tussock land and pine trees or something just to survive. And that's not what they're there for. They're stockmen.
It's just totally absurd. It really is. Laurie, I thank you for talking to us on Groundswell Radio. I'm sure in the next few weeks we're going to talk a lot more on this issue and on many others facing the rural community. But for now, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and I hope all the people out there, farmers and rural people and also city people, have some really good times ahead.
Groundswell Radio with Peter Williams, bringing town and country together. This is Groundswell Radio with Peter Williams, standing up against unworkable regulations and providing a strong advocacy voice for everyday Kiwis.
Jamie McFadden is Groundswell's environmental spokesman. First of all, Jamie, tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background? Are you a farmer or are you a scientist?
I'm come from a farming background, so my parents are sheep and beef hill country farmers, and I've been brought up on farming life. And my brother is still on the home farm, and I help out there whenever's needed. But so yes, you could say I'm still a farmer. And the other thing I do is we do a lot. My wife and I have set up a business 20 years ago. We do a lot of environmental work for farmers, lifestyle blocks, all types of landowners with native plantings, native bush restoration, wetlands, waterways, all that sort of thing.
So what part of the country are you based in, Jamie?
It's a little town called Cheviot in North Canterbury, and it's just south of Kaikoura. So it's heartland sheep and beef hill country farming.
And do you do most of your environmental work around North Canterbury, or are you in demand in other places around the South Island as well?
Well, we have put a limit to how far we will travel because we've got so much work just within the sort of the North Canterbury area. So we'll go down and cover as far as Banks Peninsula up to Kaikoura, and elsewhere we've been helping other initiatives just with advice to get them going, like Marlborough and down around Dunedin. So yeah, but in terms of our physical work, we stay in the North Canterbury area because we've got more than enough to keep us busy here.
So, Jamie, you've been very outspoken in your role with Groundswell about proposed government regulations coming in to effectively tax New Zealand farmers, or as we like to say, tax New Zealand food producers. You say it's a bad idea for farmers, for food prices, but also for the environment, the climate, and our country. And that's, I think, a direct quote from an article you wrote for the Stuff newspaper group just before Christmas, just before New Year, rather. But Jamie, tell us firstly why taxing food producers is a bad idea as far as farmers and food prices are concerned. How much are farmers going to lose income? How much are food prices likely to go up?
Well, it depends how much the tax is, but that the modelling that the government put out with their proposal suggested that there was going to be a 20% reduction in sheep and beef and a 6% reduction in dairy. And I guess a key argument from us is that New Zealand farmers are among the world's most emissions-efficient food producers. And that is what the international markets are wanting, is that they're wanting food from the most emissions-efficient food producers. So to us, it seems, it just seems ridiculous to be taxing the world's most emissions-efficient food producers and reducing their production. So that would be the first thing with the tax in terms of the food production.
And one imagines that the food that's not produced in this country, if production is down 20% in sheep and beef and 6% in dairy, one imagines that that food has to be imported from elsewhere where farmers are not as efficient.
Yeah, and it's like a whole lot of cumulative things coming together. So you've got a lot of sheep and beef farmers feeling under pressure. Their viability, their operations is struggling with the amount of compliance. You've got carbon forestry, which is knocking on the door, and a lot of farmers are saying we're unviable running just sheep and beef. And so you've got a whole lot of things that are sort of conspiring together to reduce food production or run food producers off the land, really. And then you've got all these, floods, droughts, all those sort of things going on at the same time. So with the combination of all this, reducing the number of food producers in the country, well, our food's got to come from somewhere. So, yeah, undoubtedly we're going to have to import more, or the price of what we produce locally is going to increase.
Now, I read when they signed the Paris Treaty back in, 2015, Article 2 of that treaty said that any moves taken to mitigate the impact of greenhouse gas emissions and therefore stop climate change would not impact or not have an effect on food production. That's Article 2. That's up there front and centre. Why don't New Zealand politicians pay attention to that?
Because what the current government has done is that they've focused on just New Zealand, and they have been too narrow focused on achieving the targets for New Zealand, whereas they should be looking at emissions and food production in a global context, because if they looked at it in a global context and looked at the Paris Accord, then they wouldn't be doing what they're doing here in New Zealand. So they've taken quite a selfish approach on this by just trying to achieve targets here in New Zealand, and they believe, the government believes that one of the main ways to achieve these targets is to tax New Zealand food producers. So that's their view. Now, we don't agree with that, but that is the government's view.
The great irony is that while New Zealand food producers are being taxed quite a lot, it would seem, meanwhile, the world's two greatest emitters, namely China and India, are continuing to build coal-fired power stations. So it seems that no matter what we do in this country, we're not going to have any impact on world emissions anyway. It just beggars belief that so much of a penalty is being put on the primary sector in this country, isn't it?
Yes, it does. And the other anomalies is that overseas food producers, like in the UK, there's quite a lot of subsidies now around, set aside and looking after the land. They've got a lot more of a compensation and reward approach with their farmers over there. Whereas here in New Zealand, we've got a government that takes a much more punitive approach to the farming sector. And so there's a lot of anomalies in this.
Now, Jamie, you talk about taxing farmers for their emissions being bad for the environment and also for the climate and therefore for the country. Can you just expand on that? What do you mean by that? Why are taxes on emissions bad for the environment?
So the tax on emissions, and we've worked it out for, in this district here. So there's about 150 farmers in this area of Cheviot, and based on the sort of indicative amounts that farmers would be paying in the first year, that would be close to $1 million gone out of this area alone. So that's just the small rural area of Cheviot, $1 million gone in the first year, and likely to increase after that. Now, what that means is that you've got a farming sector that's already under the pump. They're suffering, significant cost increases. You've got inflation, everything together. And one of the things that the government has not assessed, or even the Heiwaka Ekanoa partners have assessed, and we asked them this, is have they assessed what the cost would be to the environment in terms of the reduced farmer spend? Because a lot of farmers will, if this tax comes in, they'll have less money to spend on the environment. And we've seen this before with the freshwater regulations. What happened was significant costs were put on farmers, and we lost a lot of our environmental work because the farmers just didn't have the money to spend on the environment. So the tax is actually going to be significantly worse for the environment because of that. The farmers still want to do this work, but you can't do this work when you're running at a loss.
So what you're saying is that farmers who want to plant alongside streams, waterways, ponds, put in their various plants and trees and grasses to improve the water quality, they won't be able to afford to do that because, after all, those plants and the time are expensive. They won't be able to afford to do that because they would have been taxed so much for their methane emissions.
Exactly. Yeah, they're less able to afford to spend money because environmental spend is one of those discretionary areas. So after they've paid for all of their fixed costs, their electricity and irrigation takes and all your different costs, the environment is the sort of probably one of the main discretionary spend areas. And so as soon as farming sector goes into a bit of a nosedive, that's one of the main areas that is cut, discretionary spend.
Yeah, Jamie, how much attention do you think farmers have paid to the environment in say the time that you and your wife have been running your business, the last 20 years or so? Has awareness of the environment really picked up amongst the farming community as far as you can see?
Yeah, well, we were involved, my parents were involved with the Catchment Board, which was 1970s, and we've got a farm plan, 1971, I think our farm plan was done. And so at that time, a lot of farmers around here took a different approach. The government was saying, we want you to clear all your bush, we want you to drain all your wetlands in the name of production. And they were giving farmers incentives to develop their land as much as they could. What happened around here, and indeed a lot of the country, was that farmers started to say to themselves, well, that's not good for the environment or good for our farm. We want to protect some of the bush and some of the wetlands and some of the waterways. And so there was a big change through that era of the catchment boards through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then since then it's just grown. Like in the last probably 10 to 15 years since we've been in business helping farmers, it's massive now. The amount of environmental work happening on the ground is unprecedented, and it's really positive actually. And there's not many farmers now that are not on board. That's getting less and less.
But the point is, as you've been making in this particular discussion, if there's less income for farmers, they'll have less money to spend on that particular initiative. Jamie, for now, Thank you so much for talking with us here on Groundswell Radio. I'm sure that in the coming weeks we will talk a lot more about the many issues facing farmers in this country under this government, and about what the better outcomes, what the better schemes might be. Nice talking to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Peter.
Groundswell New Zealand, a grassroots movement you can trust to stand up against unworkable regulations. If our food producers are thriving, New Zealand is thriving.